السلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلوات ربي وسلامه عليه. أما بعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So tonight's Friday Night Lights is going to revolve around, it's going to jump to a lot of topics. We're very happy to have with us Ustad Mubin Vid. Ustad Mubin grew up in the Virginia, Maryland area. He is an engineer by profession, a writer by passion. I don't know, I just made that up on the alhamdulillah. But he was very involved in the Muslim community for a very long time. Sheikh Kamal used to be his Sunday school teacher back in the Virginia days. He apologizes that he's not here. He became the Amir of the Al-Maghrib chapter of Virginia back in the day, also Qabilat Nourain, alhamdulillah. And he's been writing and researching a lot on the topic of LGBT as well as sexual ethics and the Islamic framework and Islamic, the Islamic vision of family as well. And so we're very happy to have him, inshallah ta'ala, for the workshop tomorrow. Today, as you can see, it's only two of us. But it's actually three today, inshallah, because the third microphone is for you. We want to make sure, inshallah ta'ala, that this is a very interactive session because there's so many questions and so many comments. I'm sure, inshallah ta'ala, this conversation is going to inspire. So we're going to need somebody with nimble feet to be the mic rotator, inshallah ta'ala, for the audience. But other than that, let's begin, Sheikh. So, I guess right from the beginning, what made you start, taking on these topics and researching them?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm not that loud usually, so okay? Okay.
Can y'all hear him in the back? Just wave, yes? Kind of?
Okay.
Just move your lavalier up a little bit.
A little bit higher. Is that better?
Is it better? Kind of?
Okay, inshallah. I'll try to speak up.
Yeah.
So I'll reinforce something that Sheikh Ammar mentioned after Salah, which is merely that we're talking about a number of adult topics, and so if your children are here, just make a judgment call, inshallah, and use your discretion as to whether or not the content is appropriate. I'll try to be as discreet as possible. I'm a parent myself, and so I certainly understand the sensitivity around the subject. To answer your question as to why I started, I'd say that there were a number of things that happened over the years that I saw as underlying causes that started to get me interested in wanting to write about it and feeling motivated to begin writing. One of them was simply the fact that as a community and as a society, our own society began shifting quite dramatically as it related to the topic itself. So how people viewed sexuality, obviously the LGBT movement and everything else became a lot more public, a lot more prominent, much more accepted in various spaces. And so the idea was that as Muslim community, there was a much stronger imperative to understand Islam's position on these things. Right? Why are certain things halal? Why are they haram? All of that became a matter of necessity. In addition to that, especially from academic corners in the West, you had people who began writing articles that were revisionist and that were calling into question.
What does revisionist mean? We're going to break this down.
Yeah, so they're revising what Muslims have basically always understood the Quran to say, right? And so what they do is that they take contemporary concepts and ideas and then they apply them to the Quran. And so for instance, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very clearly prohibits zina, they'll say what zina? Zina is actually when an intimate act takes place that's non-consensual, right? Which obviously that's the meaning of zina. It can be totally consensual. It's still haram, right? It's still haram. That it doesn't pivot on the basis of consent. But the idea is that people start applying new categories, terms, or concepts to things that exist in the tradition, and they were doing that a lot with the topic of homosexuality, and that there were a couple of books that were written on this subject. Again, mostly in academic quarters, not really things that most Muslims were familiar with, But if you were a young Muslim and you were in college, and if you're in graduate school, you're majoring in the social sciences or the humanities, there's a good chance that you'd come across those books, you'd get them assigned. If you're in religious studies, almost certainly at some point, especially if you're doing gender studies as a specialization or something along those lines, you'd come across them. So more and more people are coming across that literature that had been out there, and there was more that was being written along those lines. And so you had a lot more that was being written arguing along those lines, and so there needed to be a response at some point that Muslims were contributing. I also found that in general, Muslims didn't have a really developed discourse on this subject. And so most Muslims didn't really engage in the topic of sexual ethics at all. And
beyond it just saying it's haram.
Yeah, I mean, even people saying it's haram wasn't really being done all that much. I mean, maybe you'd have like a gender relations seminar or something in a masjid once in a while. But the idea that anyone was getting a really mature, intelligent, thoughtful discussion in the Muslim community around the topic of gender relations or sex and sexuality or marriage or family or anything in between. There's always sort of the go-to topics of, we're lamenting the condition of marriage, we're talking about rising divorce rates, or we're talking about, other, parent-child relationships, birrul walidain. I mean, these are all very important subjects, but they're the type of subjects that people have been talking about and are much easier to address in a lot of ways. Obviously, our norms, our values, our commitments in those spaces are much clearer, and people still sort of understand why they are what they are. In other arenas, however, people were quite confused, and a lot of people were scared to talk about it, right? And that fear has only grown over the years. And so as more and more people have been fearful to speak up on issues like this, especially if you're in a position where you're going to have a diverging view from what's popular socially, what happens is people get accustomed to just kind of being quiet, right?
So what do you mean? Are you seeing that zina is just becoming, what's the word? People are acquiescing to the notion that it's fine, or?
Well, not necessarily zina. I mean, zina, the difference is, I think, one, socially speaking, people still tend to see adultery and fornication as bad things, more or less. I mean, most people would say that adultery is a legitimate cause for breaking off a marriage, for instance, or ending a marriage if someone's unfaithful. I think most people still kind of get that.
But that's because there's harm.
The harm argument is always it's like a subjective argument, who's physically harmed. They'd say that there's an emotional toll that's being taken, although they'd say that emotional harm isn't always really recognized. So that's like a bigger argument, right? Like what's harm and the harm principle. There's a lot of debate around that. But nevertheless, I mean, the idea is that people, what they judge to be licit and illicit or right and wrong isn't dependent on a consistent standard. It's based on what society accepts, right? Society accepts certain things and it rejects other things. And what society accepts changes over time. And sometimes it changes in our lifetime in ways that we don't even recognize. And those shifts can be very subtle. I think for most of us who are older, we probably remember, for instance, a society where people didn't have smartphones or the internet, right? I remember, right, growing up without the internet. That seems like a different world. Like we almost can't imagine a society and a world in which people don't have access to the internet or don't have a smartphone. Right? The idea that I would drive to someone's house, remember I'd call them, I'd write directions down on a sheet of paper, I would take it with me in the car, and if I was lost, I'd try to find, I didn't know where I was, right? I'd try to drive around, see if I could get to a gas station.
Ask someone on the street.
Yeah, ask someone on the street, use a payphone to try to get to their home. That's a world that is completely foreign now, right? We habituate ourselves. It's called the process of normativity, right? You become accustomed to living in a new world. And once you get accustomed to that, that's just kind of how society in the world is. And in many ways, that's what's happened specifically on the issue of homosexuality. That's happening right now on the issue of transgenderism, where people who now, even people who grew up during a time where they remember that there were, obviously, like the majority of society was opposed to these things in various ways. Now we're in a society where for most people, that type of attitude seems very, very, it seems medieval almost, right? Like that's a primitive attitude or an attitude that was held very long ago and is therefore backwards, it's illegitimate, it's bigoted, it's hateful. And when those are the assumptions of how certain, if you're holding that certain sexual acts are wrong, and people look at that and they say that that's a bigoted, hateful view, well, that's a really difficult position to put Muslims in, especially young Muslims who are confronted with these types of attacks and don't really have a clear, easy way to respond, especially when you yourself are occasionally, if not frequently, the subject of hate, right? You are targeted for various reasons. You recognize how difficult it can be when people are targeting you as a group or as a community. You appreciate that, you're sensitive to it, and suddenly now people are accusing you of expressing hate. And you say, okay, well, I don't want to be a hateful person. And so what happens is, either sort of quietly, wittingly, or unwittingly, more and more Muslims shift the other direction, right? And they become in favor of these things. Or if they hold some moral objection, they hold them privately. I think it's wrong, but I just think it's wrong for arbitrary reasons, not because it actually makes any sense. And that I don't think is very sustainable, because when you think you're just holding on to certain beliefs and positions because they're just irrational, they're just things that you're just doing because you have to do it, you typically don't really believe those things anyways. Right? Most of the time you're just kind of telling yourself you do, but you typically don't. And
on the issue of homosexuality,
yeah.
I mean, you get that question a lot, which is, well,
Yeah.
what's wrong with it, right? Especially high school kids.
Yeah. I mean, you get that question from a lot of corners. I think one of the challenges is that most people don't understand sort of what, like, a positive sexual ethic, right? What are the sexual ethics of Islam grounded in? And frankly, not only Islam, but every major religion, any traditional society would have recognized as the fundamental basis for organizing human beings. And sex has always been tethered to the concept of family. Those two things have always existed side by side. It has never been the case that people just looked at sex as an expression of intimate interactions between two people who are just sort of casually making a choice. That's how it's looked at today. It's a lifestyle decision. It's just me, like, living how I want to live. No, I mean, the idea was that, sort of the legitimate way in which people can have sexual relations is in a context in which they're prepared to support what comes out of it, which is in a family and in the context of a marriage. And sexual activities that occur outside of that context are illegitimate, not only because they don't have the support structure needed to support children, but also because when you're not engaged in sexuality in that particular mode, you're actually doing something that's transgressive and violative. You're in fact, one of the things in the Sharia, for instance, one of the definitions that's very common, in fact, I think it's the default definition for dhulm, injustice. In Islam, it's wada' shay fi ghayri mawdi'ihi, to put something in its improper place. And so when you talk about sexual activities that occur outside of that paradigm that is male and female, you're doing something that's not even properly sex, and you're violating the procreative purpose of sex, which is it's tied to family, it's tied to the reproduction and proliferation of humanity.
But what if a person doesn't even agree with that preposition that it is for procreation? That's the only reason why it's...
Well, not every single act of sex will be procreative in purpose, but it will be that in form, right? That would be the legitimate use of it, and that's where it's licit. Now, obviously, like, someone today can come and say, well, I don't agree with it, and I agree that it should just be something that's based on, two people's interest. And so what you have is a contest between people who are foundationally in conflict, right? I mean, that's part of the problem that we have today. And hopefully, inshallah, my goal tomorrow, not to plug the workshop, but my goal in the workshop is actually to start off not necessarily by talking about sexual ethics, but by talking about ethics in general. Because what happens is most of the conversations we're engaged in with people, they exist above the surface. But there's so much that exists below the surface, and so many assumptions that are baked into how people speak, that unless we're able to unpackage those assumptions, it can be a very, very difficult conversation to have, right? So it's like your question when you started, you said, well, what's the harm? Well, you kind of have to take a step back and say, well, what do you mean by harm? Or that's harmful. Harmful to whom? Who gets to define what harm is? These things are very subjective, right? And likewise, when someone says, well, okay, I just don't agree with that, I agree with something else, well, you say, well, why do you think that? Like, why don't you justify how you see legitimate and illegitimate sex, right? Why should that be the case? Because we can actually identify various harms, for instance, if we're going to talk about harms, that exists in a society where homosexuality proliferates.
Okay.
And we can
I think these are the things that people are unfamiliar with.
Yeah. So certainly we can say that any society that does that at scale takes a spiritual toll, right? And that's a real thing. I mean, a lot of people don't consider that serious, but for as Muslims, we should consider that very serious. That we are not just sort of material, dead matter in this world, but we have a soul, we have a spirit, and we have a spiritual heart. And when people engage in sins and they proliferate sins, what happens is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes blessedness away from that society. And there are harms that occur as a function or a byproduct of that. And you have verses in the Quran that are quite explicit about that. Right? ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ. Right? That it has become sort of evident and apparent on the land and sea, transgression, right? Transgression and corruption has spread on land and sea because of what people have done by their own hands. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in one verse. And there are others as well where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about that. So that's a significant one. In addition to that, we'd say that when transgressive acts become normative, there are obviously we'd say that there are tolls on the actors themselves, on the people who engage in these things, right? That they're not things through which a person can find wholesomeness or psychosocial health. Typically these are things that only lead people down a very difficult, transgressive, evil path, right? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even when He spoke about zina, He said, إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا, that it's an evil way to go. And so one could say that a society that begins doing this, and we look at a society like ours, begins devaluing the family, because the family is no longer tethered to any special importance.
But what about with legalizing gay couples to get married? So the argument of family, well, they're creating their families now.
Well, yeah, so again, it goes back to, we just have to keep unpackaging assumptions. So someone says, well, what does it mean to have a marriage? Is a marriage just two people living together who enjoy each other's company and share an intimate bond? What makes a marriage more special or unique or distinct from two roommates who have a lot of love for each other? Or two people who just cohabit with one another? Or a group of people who live together and they love each other a lot? There can be really unique and distinctive forms of love and community that can form when you have a group of people who live together for a long time. What makes their relationships any less legitimate or important or worthy of recognition than a marriage, right? And so what we have to go back and ask the question is, what does a marriage, quote unquote, consecrate? What does it signify? What is it related to? One of the things that's happened is that, traditionally you had a couple of things that were bound up together. You had sex, you had reproduction, and you had family. Those three things were viewed as necessarily coupled. That all of these things are part of a single entity. Which is to say that parents, for instance, a mother and a father is not just a label that we give to a male and a female figure who have custody of a child. But there's actually something really consequential about bringing a child into the world through the act of reproduction, right? The reproductive act that brings a child into the world and then raising that child in the context of a family is immensely significant. And that's why even traditionally, societies far and wide have honored mothers and they've honored fathers. And they have sought to protect that relationship. And they've gone very far in doing a lot to protect that relationship. You see this even with ancient cultures and ancient societies where they have poetry and different types of literature that's written praising motherhood, for instance, and maternity, and that speak about the importance of guardianship and fatherhood and all of those types of things. I mean, they're very special relationships. If you look at motherhood and fatherhood and say, well, it's just, in some ways, there's nothing unique or special or significant about that relationship. It's something that a person's defaulted into through biological accident, that two random people can actually choose to take care of that child, and because they're choosing and the others aren't, their relationship is actually more significant and meaningful than those who aren't choosing, right? And so you can sort of rationally, aqli, play a lot of games to produce outcomes when it comes to how you want to organize societies. And at the end of it, what you're proposing is to live in a way that like 99% of human beings would have never acknowledged or even recognized as plausible. You're living in a way that even animals don't live. I mean, even in animal life, one of the things that's very profound is how deep and meaningful family life is for animals. One of the common things that people talk about is like lone wolves. But wolves are actually intensely familial. There's no such thing as like the lone wolf in animal life. And you see this with just about every single form of animal, that they form social community ordered around family. Now, obviously, animals aren't like one-to-one with human beings, but it goes to show that there's a greater creative structure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in this world. And when human beings begin to transgress that, what begins to happen is they not only lose their relationship with how society should function, they begin to lose their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why if you look in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always pairs tawheed with being good to one's parents. وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. And your Lord has decreed that there's none worthy of worship but Him, and that you're good to your parents. Right? I mean, that's huge. The idea, the Prophet ﷺ goes and he does the hijrah. And the first address in Medina, he says, أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ أَفْشُوا السَّلَامِ, right? Spread peace, وَأَطْعِمُوا الطَّعَامِ, and feed others, وَصِلُوا الْأَرْحَامِ, and maintain the ties of kinship. Maintain the ties of kinship. Those ties that are bound up through the womb are very important ties. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, this is the first address he's giving when they arrive in Medina, and he's referring to that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, when he refers to disbelievers, munafiqeen, one of their signs is that they cut off the ties of kinship. تَقَطَّعُوا أَرْحَامَهُمْ. Right? That's what they're doing. They're cutting off those ties. It's a really, like, uquq al-walidain is from the kaba'ir. It's actually a major sin for a person to be disrespectful towards their parents. And this is because in Islam, one of the fundamental foundations of an Islamic society and a society that reflects God's purpose for us is that it places a huge emphasis on the family structure. And what you have in our society is a complete collapse of that structure. So you have fewer people getting married. People who are getting married get married at much later ages. You have far fewer children entering the world. And so if you look at reproduction rates throughout Western societies, almost all of them are below replacement levels, which is to say that most of those countries now are in population decline. The United States, I believe, just recently went below replacement levels or is right at it. And its reproduction rates are actually being held up by immigrants. Immigrants are the ones that are holding it up because they have more children, but you give it a generation and you decrease immigration. And what's going to happen here is that populations are going to decline too. And this is starting to happen now in the Muslim world, where you have Muslim societies which traditionally put a huge emphasis on family, had a lot of children. Now they're having fewer and fewer children because they're being westernized as well, culturally, socially, and otherwise.
But does this necessarily have to deal with our sexual ethics?
Yeah, I mean,
the constriction of family?
Yeah, so the idea here is that what makes contemporary sexual ethics like apprehensible to us is the same thing that actually weakens the family unit, that those two things are actually connected together. They're not independent variables where you say, okay, can you sort of have a strong family structure, and also, well, you'd say if you actually had a very strong family structure in societies and you had a society that placed a big emphasis on this, that necessarily would actually undermine the generation of a huge social movement that would actually question what marriages are supposed to look like, or what context sex is supposed to take place in, and all of those other things, right? And so those two things are actually connected in very, very significant ways, which is why I bring it up. I mean, today it's not only that, it's also the question of, now there's a huge question of what does it even mean to be a man or a woman, right? And so the confusion grows and grows and grows. And those are all very troubling signs, because once the wheels start coming off, you have more and more vice and transgression that proliferates. And as a community, your ability to stay untouched from all of this and to remain upright and to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command becomes more difficult. And look, this has happened. This has happened with Christian communities now where they've been immensely fractured over the years. So you have liberal Christian denominations and conservative Christian denominations, and the liberal ones are all affirming and pro-LGBT. You've had Jewish groups and denominations that have been through this over the years. And even the ones that are left, that are not affirming, are continuously struggling with this issue. The Catholic community, I mean, if you've been following the news with them over the past few years, just recently you had a major cardinal, one that is very close to the Pope, sort of in status and rank, who came out and said, essentially, that the Bible is wrong on homosexuality. I mean, he basically said that in so many words, which is an astonishing thing for someone at his position to say. And he said it's time for us to change, and we have to get with the times, right? And so when you see those types of transitions taking place, as Muslims, we need to get ahead of these types of issues. We need to talk about them, and we need to convey them in a way that communicates why our sexual ethics are important, why they make sense, why they're valuable, and why the family, which it's all related to, is such an important part of our beliefs and also part of our communities, right?
I actually want to open up, we've already opened up a lot of different topics, but I want to ask if there are any particular questions on the points that have been mentioned so far before we move on, inshallah ta'ala. Anybody with any questions, comments? Yes, sir, Khalid. This is Sheikh Khamad's brother, by the way.
Oh, mashallah. Yeah.
Anyway, there's a question I have been wanting to ask for a while.
Sure.
This idea that being like a homosexual is something you're born with, because that's quite a conspiracy.
Yeah, so the brother asked, I'll just repeat his question, or you can ask it on the mic. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Azimuddin just made you stand up for no reason. Here, I got you. Hold on.
It wasn't that long a question.
Here
You want me to just repeat it? No?
Okay.
Bismillah. Yeah.
I guess anybody can hear me now? All right.
Mm.
Anyway, I was actually just wondering, where did this idea that being a homosexual is something you're born with? Because I've heard this conspiracy for quite some time now.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about it as a conspiracy. A lot of people would say it's like fact, right? That's how they discuss it. So that what they called homosexual essentialism, which is the idea that people are just essentially gay and that it has a biological origin, biological determinism. That argument really picked up in the 90s and became a very prominent argument. And the reason was back then is that religion was a bit stronger in the United States and in Western countries in general. And
I'm sorry, what was a bit stronger again?
Huh?
Religion, he said.
Religion.
Oh, okay.
Religion was. And the way to sort of challenge religious communities on this was to say, well, we were born this way, God made us that way. If God made us this way, how can he then make it wrong for us to act according to how he made us? Like he's given us all of these predispositions that are very strong, and now we have no method or means by which we can actually act on it. That seems to be quite cruel. And so that argument was actually in the 90s quite effective. And it usually at that time, the big thing was the gay gene argument. In recent years, especially in like the past decade, that argument has completely collapsed. There was maybe 2 years ago, there's a website, it's called the New Atlantis. They published a review of all of the research studies that have been done trying to create or trying to argue for a gay gene, and they found that none of the studies have actually produced the goods needed to support it. And so at least biologically, it's still sort of an open question. Is it genetic? Maybe, but no one really knows. There are zero definitive, conclusive, unquestioned studies that one can point to and say, okay, that gene itself is an indication of someone's sexual orientation, quote unquote. But that's where that sort of grew out of, more or less.
So it was basically like political pressure for
Yeah,
the most part.
Yeah, what one might look at as strategic, right? And from a person who's experiencing those urges, it may actually be in good faith, where they're saying, look, I have, a person might say, I have a certain set of sexual urges. You do too. You didn't choose yours. I didn't choose mine. Why am I being stigmatized for mine? It seems to me that you're just doing that because I'm different, right? And if you're against me just because I'm different, well, then that's discrimination, right? That doesn't seem to me to be very fair. And if your religion is saying that I myself am wrong, or that there's something wrong with me because of that, well, that seems to be a very cruel way to think about religion. You know, recently, this is in 2020 when they did the Democratic Town Hall, I remember Elizabeth Warren was asked about, you know, has she ever struggled as a Christian trying to reconcile her pro-LGBT positions with the Bible and her Christianity. And she said, I've never struggled to reconcile that because I've never struggled to see people as fully human. And that's how she answered the question. It was something along those lines. And I found that answer quite telling, because what that question does is it presupposes that if you are communicating the immorality of certain sexual acts, what you're doing now is you're actually undermining the humanity of certain human beings in the minds of a lot of people. And certainly that's where the default position is for a lot of people in society today. And so what we have to do is try to unpackage all of that, unpack all of those assumptions to say, hold on, is that all that person is? Many people feel sexual urges, acting on them is where the immorality comes in. The idea that you've given a label to this, where now that person is now essentially gay or lesbian or something like that, well, that's how they've labeled themselves. We don't, like, that's not even a positive label to take on. We don't actually look at the legitimacy of that label. That label's a very...
Can you just talk about that? Because, like, I don't want this to go over people's heads. You're saying that the idea of, it's just taken for granted now.
Yeah.
I'm gay, I'm straight, I'm bisexual, I'm this or that, and you identify yourself like your entire being is this. How recent is it, this idea that you actually are identifying yourself based on your sexual impulses?
Yeah, this is probably the past 100 years or so it's very recent. You know, at earliest,
like out of all of the
maybe
things that a person
years.
would use to define themselves,
Absolutely,
you could use occupation, you could use family, you can use a million things.
So when it comes to the identity part is essential. It is essential to understand. So if you just think about the idea of an identity, and what is an identity? There are a number of things that are features of who you are, that are descriptive of you, but they're not your identity. Right?
Like, give us some examples.
Like your height.
Okay.
If I'm tall, someone might say, hey, you're tall. You're like, yeah, I'm a tall guy, right? But I don't think I'm tall.
You don't identify yourself as a short king?
That's not an essential part of who I am.
Thank you.
That's not an essential part of such that when I meet people, I'd say, yeah, my name is Wahid, and I'm tall, right? Like people say, well, that's like a weird way to like think of yourself, like it's a really essential part of who you are. That actually seems very superficial. Most people would say that, right? Like that's like a very superficial way to look at yourself, that you're just reducing yourself to your height, for instance. That's all you've done. You've taken one aspect of who you are and you've said that this is my core identity, and I'm fronting that as part of my discussions with other people, and when I tell them about me, this is what I'm telling them, right? And that's a bit more of like a trivial example, because people don't do that today, and most of us laugh. It's like you met somebody and they'd say, yeah, I'm short.
But some people would use the race, for example.
Some people might use race, right? Some people might use...
As a core element of their identity.
Yeah, as a core element of their identity. Others may not look at their race that way. Some people may look at their ethnicity that way. Some people may not. You know, most people don't look at like their hair color that way, obviously. You know, but there are things like that. There are a lot of things that we have that form part of who we are that aren't essential to our identity. Some of them may be prioritized as within how we think of ourselves, and some of those things may not be bad things, right? Like our ethnicity. If a person has sort of a healthy relationship with where they're from, and they see that as really significant to who they are, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I'm Texan.
Yeah, I'm Texan, I'm this and that, as long as it's not like an asabiya that they're using to justify wrong or something like that,
okay.
or they're using it to assert some sort of superiority over others, right? Those things can be negative, but they can also be positive if you say, look, I'm this, and it means that I'm more generous, right? Because everything's bigger in Texas or something, right? Like that. I mean, there's ways that you can take it, you can actually make it a virtuous thing. Nevertheless, when it comes to homosexuality, the idea that I have a certain sexual urge, or that I have sexual urges in certain directions, and that that's the core of my identity, and that's just the essence of who I am, is central to the contemporary discussion of sexual ethics. Because when that's central to who you are as a person, when I begin to question the legitimacy of certain sexual acts that are tied to that identity, the way that a person views that is that I'm actually questioning his or her personhood,
Existence.
like their very existence in society, because that's defined me. And it defines me not only in terms of telling you and communicating to you who I want to have sex with or who I think of having sex with, but it also defines what I think culturally, what I think socially, what I think politically, what I think religiously. All of these things are bound up in these labels. And so they become very toxic labels to take on. Now, as Muslims, the essence of our identity isn't predicated on our sexual attractions. It's predicated on our relationship with Allah. That's what it's predicated on. And that's why our essential identity as Muslims is that we are Muslim. Right? That is supposed to form the basis, the foundation of our very being. When we think of ourselves, the first thing that should come to our mind is that, what sort of defines my relationship to reality and everything in it is that I'm a Muslim. And that I am submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And from that, everything else extends out. And any other identity I have, ethnically, racially, or anything else, is conditioned by that fact. So that if my ethnic identity or my cultural identity tries to pull me to do something un-Islamic, I'd say, no, I can't go there. People might say, oh, everyone here, oh, aren't you, this, aren't you from Sudan? Everyone from Sudan does. You'd say, no, but I'm Muslim. Not everyone from Sudan has to do this. And if it means that everyone from Sudan has to do this, well, then I'm not going to be that type of Sudani person, right? That's how you'd respond to a situation like that. And some of us are very accustomed to understanding the cultural pressures that can come when some cultures make normative or normalize certain un-Islamic things. That can be difficult pressure to stay outside of. That type of conglomeration takes place in spades when it comes to the sexual identity. And the problem with it is that you're not attaching yourself to something benign or something that can actually be virtuous, the way that an ethnic identity might be. You might be able to craft that and hold on to it as something that's quite positive and useful, or even mostly harmless, right? Although it can be harmful as well. But the idea is that you don't have that same possibility when someone's core identity is that I'm gay or I'm lesbian. Because that identity is bound up in not only the urges, but an entire lifestyle that surrounds that. And for you to then try to intervene and say, look, you're more than just your sexual attractions. Like, that's not all you are. That's a very small part of your being. You have certain sexual attractions, you have certain urges, understood. But you actually have a lot of other things in your life. And those things are actually a lot more meaningful to you. And they can be places in which you can find meaning, and you can find psychosocial health, and you can find purpose, and you can find value, and you can find solidarity, community. There's so much that you can find through those other identities that you're ignoring, or you're subordinating to the sexual identity, which suddenly now is prized. It's given this position of primacy, and no one can actually have a conversation about it, because once you start having a discussion about it, you're speaking about like their very humanity, all right? And you're not even recognizing that in the minds of people.
Is the idea of if this person has this attraction, okay,
Yeah.
and you're telling them that it's haram, you are now designating them to a lifetime of loneliness.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
that's obviously,
At
yeah.
the end of the day, isn't companionship like a core need for human beings?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are a couple of things there, right? One is that assumes that sexual attraction is just like an immutable part or an unchangeable part of our being. For some people, it may in fact be changeable, and that's one of the problems with the identity, is it forecloses on that possibility. It says that this is who I am and this is who I'm always going to be. And if you look even in recent years, that's actually a tough argument to make. I don't think I think actually it was probably an easier argument to make in the 90s when people were talking about born this way and stuff like that. And I say that because there are more and more people who are coming out now as bi and this and that. And so,
Is there a difference that you see between male and female in this regard?
yeah, so at least statistically, they say that lesbianism is a lot more volatile. And so you'll have, especially amongst teenagers, but even post-teen, you'll have many women who identify as lesbian who later go on to get married and have children. Not all of them do, but it's more statistically common. Whereas men who identify as gay, it's not as common for that type of transition to happen. In fact, it's far more rare. So that's that. If for someone to say companionship's a core part of our being, we'd say, yeah, but there are other, like not all companionship has to be sexual, right? There are many very important parts of like companionship and living, and Platonic forms of love are very common in Muslim societies, even traditionally. Even from us, right, from our perspective, there's a lot in our tradition that a person might look at today, and they may feel uncomfortable about it because they say, oh, that sounds kind of gay or something like that. But that's not what it is, right? Telling your brother that you love them, for instance.
Okay, what do you think about this argument?
Yeah?
Is that the reason why that type of friendship can exist in the Muslim societies is because there is it's allowed to flourish, meaning the presence of homosexuality means that you are now placing sexual tension between every human relationship.
Yeah.
In the sense that between men and women, there's a general sexual tension which prohibits from them having that type of platonic friendship.
Yeah.
But men still have half the world to be able to have those relationships with, that platonic friendship between brothers. And sisters also have half the world to be able to create those meaningful relationships, platonic friendship between sisters. But now when you have the proliferation of homosexuality en masse, that means that every particular relationship can be sexualized.
Yeah, it can, and it means that people are going to be more reticent to form those types of bonds.
What does reticent mean for us?
They're going to be more apprehensive, right?
Like
they're going to be on guard.
Now when you're talking about an 11-year-old kid
Yeah.
who wants to go sleep over with his friend's house, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, if it was like girls, you'd say no, like because or 12 or 13 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But now, even with regards to boys, it becomes something that's volatile.
Yeah, and even in Muslim societies, at least from what I've heard, the things that used to be more common have become less common, where two men would hold hands in some societies. I've heard a lot of those customs have completely fallen by the wayside, largely for these same reasons, right? For the same reasons as that, you've had the spread of Western media and Western culture, and Westernization tends to have this effect where suddenly now everything that used to be very normal in those cultures gains all of these connotations that, it's like, okay, well, is this what I'm trying to imply? Is this what I'm trying to communicate? If I don't want to do it, I'm not going to, if that's not what I want to communicate, then I'm suddenly not going to do it. And so even cultures where things were once normal, those things stop becoming normal, right? And so you're right. I mean, there's a way in which it has a stifling effect on normal human relations. And that's really damaging as well, because people of the same gender can't really develop wholesome and fulfilling and deep and meaningful relationships in the same way. And a lot of the type of expressions that were quite common and pivotal to those relationships are looked at as inappropriate things to say now. Right? Like you don't talk to your brother that way, you don't talk to your sister that way, you just don't speak that way in general, and so it's always, more, it's always more at a distance, right?
Yeah.
Which may also explain why people have fewer friends today, which is a bit of an irony because people have a lot of friends online, but people, when it comes to like meaningful relationships, the type of relationships where I have a friend that I can confide in and that I would sacrifice for, and I know would sacrifice for me, that type of relationship is far rarer in a society like ours. People talk a lot today about like frenemies, right? Everyone's kind of a friend, but they're also an enemy in various ways. And so that seems to be the modern model of friendships. But you're right. I mean, this is part of the impact of certain types of discourses and ideas that get normalized and regularized in a society. And now it's like, okay, the only way I can find a deeper and more meaningful relationship and build community and build companionship is through a sexual relationship. And so even now addressing the problem of loneliness, that's the only way to actually address it. as opposed to realizing that, in traditional societies, for instance, loneliness was very rare because you lived among and around so many people, right?
Explain this to us, because you would think from the outside looking in, people would be having more friends than ever before, more romantic relationships than ever before. I mean, all you have to do is swipe left and match, or swipe right, or whatever it is, right? But at the same time, I don't know if it's swipe left or swipe right, and don't tell me. I don't. But that's the idea, right?
Yeah, they say.
But it's actually less. Everything is actually becoming less. Society is becoming more lonely than ever before.
Yeah, and that's the irony of a lot of these things, right? Is that it's counterintuitive. Right? A lot of young people, for instance, they'll say this. They'll say, oh, one of the problems with like Muslim communities that they're so strict between boys and girls. Then they grow up and they can't get married, right? You say, well, actually groups and communities and social spaces where they're just totally open like that, they actually don't seem to get married very often at all. Actually, the likelihood of getting married when you've actually maintained propriety is much higher. In fact, men and women that cohabit, for instance, cohabitation, where men and women just live together in an apartment, if that relationship leads to a marriage, cohabitation is one of the leading indicators of a divorce. It's almost guaranteed that relationship is probably not going to last because they were cohabiting beforehand, which is, again, counterintuitive.
Cohabiting is when two people live together. So
it's just like a guy and a girl that just live together and probably have an intimate relationship.
I mean, they're dating and they moved in and they didn't get married.
Yeah, and they didn't get married, and sometimes that went on for some period of time. But the idea is that one would think that would be
the best testing ground for marriage.
Yeah, like that's suggestive of success, right? Like that would be a more successful way because we've gotten to know each other so well, and we've gone through so much before marriage that now our marriage is like bound to be successful.
It's just adding a piece of paper.
Yeah, but it's actually quite the opposite, right? It's quite the opposite in terms of what happens. And likewise with all of these things, right? So if you look today, as I mentioned, fewer people are getting married, fewer people are having children, fewer people are actually having sex these days. There's statistics on that as well. Fewer people are building friendships, even though they have so many online friends. Actually, this is one of the really challenging things, and this is an academic space which has been growing, especially over the past couple of years in universities, is a discipline that's called loneliness studies. And so these are dedicated departments where you have full-time researchers and professors that are writing books and researching on the growing phenomenon of loneliness, especially among the elderly. Especially among the elderly, it's become a major issue. But even outside of the elderly, when you talk about depressive episodes and things like that, they're often tied to loneliness. And it's partly because modern society has enabled a degree of loneliness that was not possible previously.
And how is loneliness tied to our discussion right now?
Well, if you are lonely in this way and you have an opportunity to join a community and to be part of something, and to not only join a community, but to find purpose through an identity, and then through that purpose also find romantic affection, then that's actually a very attractive proposition. That's a very attractive proposition. When the alternative is languishing alone, not having friendships, not having relationships, not having an identity that you have any pride in. A lot of people have, I'm just, a person who's, sometimes the identities they have can be looked at very disparagingly, right? I'm this male who's oppressive and this and that. And so it's like, okay, well, and I'm like alone living in this apartment and people, it can be very isolating and alienating to live a life like that. Now, how long can people go on like that, right? And so, LGBT.
Don't worry, they're going into the metaverse.
Yeah, well, yeah.
We're going into the metaverse. Reality privilege is going to be over. We're all going to be 6'4", mashallah.
Well, that's what they say about apartments, right? Apartments, they say, are very aptly termed because what they do is they enable people to live very close to each other, but always stay apart. That they actually never mix or learn to, I remember, when I started working back in the day, my first job, it was still common for companies at times, depending on the type of job you were getting, to use a neighbor as a reference. So they'd say, okay, do you have a neighbor that we can call as a reference?
A neighbor?
A neighbor, yeah. It was not totally uncommon. They'd say, okay, because the idea is your neighbor knows you. Your neighbor actually knows who you are. Today, that's like, your neighbor has no clue who you are. You can live next to a neighbor for years and not know their name. Most of the time, you don't want to socialize with your neighbors. That's the kind of world we're in. When I was growing up, it was common for neighborhoods, right? Neighborhood block parties, and for homeowners groups and all that to talk. Now they have their next door as an app, and they have apps like that where they're trying to recreate some of these things, because people are beginning to realize just how profound the loss of community is. There's a really interesting book by Robert Putnam. Putnam's definitely the last name. I want to say it's Robert Putnam. Very famous sociologist, and he has a book called Bowling Alone. And it is singular. It was like written in the early 90s too. So there's a more recent edition that was published in the early 2000s. And he starts off the book by talking about bowling. And he says that in America, bowling was one of the strongest pastimes in our society. More people in the 60s and 70s bowled than voted. So like the number of people, I didn't realize wow, that many people were bowling in America, but I guess it was very, very common. Everyone was part of a bowling league. And what he charts is the decline in bowling leagues, in bowling teams, and the number of people who are signing up for these things, and actually bowling alleys closing down. And that's where his book starts. And then he starts applying that to everything else. Homeowners associations, churches, PTAs. You start going down the line, and everything is just collapsing. And it's slow, but you start seeing the decline statistically. And what he's charting is sort of this growth in social atomization, which is that people are becoming lonely. In the UK, under Theresa May, so this was before Boris Johnson, Theresa May actually appointed a minister of loneliness in the UK. Because she said at the time, this is our single biggest problem that we have socially in our society, and until we figure it out, said we are staring in the face. We're looking at what could potentially be an entire social collapse of our society. That people are living alone and they're dying alone. And that's a very, very scary and daunting prospect. In fact, one of the things that you have in certain countries, in Japan this is quite common, in other countries you have this as well, as you have, and it's kind of a crude term, and I'm sorry to bring it up very explicitly, but it's like they call them cleanup crews, because you have so many people that pass away alone. And those people have no family, they have no relatives, they have no one that checks up on them. And it is only when their body begins decaying that there's any recognition that these people have died. And so these cleanup crews are actually federal institutions and groups and departments that go in and are responsible for disposing of the bodies and burying them and doing and cleaning up the residences. And those types of stories are growing across Europe, even in the United States on occasion it's growing. And part of that is simply a function of the world that we're in. And so all of these things are tied together. And when a person when you just look at this issue and someone comes up to you and says, well, what problem do you have about two adults choosing how to live their lives and just what they do in their own bedroom? Why is it your problem? Say, wait, well, hold on, that's a very superficial way to try to propose the issue or to even frame the issue. That's not what's at heart. In some ways, I don't care what people are doing. You've made it my issue. In some ways, you've made it my issue by making it this big public program. And you're putting me in a position where I have to explain why I have an issue with it. And if I'm able to do that, you give me the time, I can actually explain why not only is this an issue and why it's immoral, but why all of the consequences that come out of accepting that type of sexual ethic, that type of social ethic, is directly producing or contributing to the decline of our societies in really, really major ways.
And we need that time tomorrow.
Inshallah.
That's the plan, inshallah. Khalid, you're going to be there? Inshallah. Okay. Don't hit us with the inshallah, but just the inshallah. All right. We're already at an hour past. I feel bad
none of the sisters got to ask any questions. I don't know if they have any.
We do need to open up the floor, inshallah ta'ala, for questions. I want to make sure everybody gets.
I'll try to be more succinct, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yes, Frank.
Forbid people from doing certain things because it was imitation of the kuffar.
Sure.
An example, shaving part of the hair and other parts.
Yep.
As far as
No, not really. So there isn't any contextual.
You can repeat the question.
So the question was about, so the brother asked about how certain prohibitions in Islam relate to dissociating from disbelievers. Where the Prophet ﷺ would say that the disbelievers do this, so don't be like them, right? And one of the things, there are actually a number of hadith where he says so it would be different, but I think he mentioned sort of trimming the mustache and growing the beard as a hadith where, tashabbuh bil kuffar, that sort of imitating the kuffar comes in. The prohibition of same-sex acts is actually quite explicit, and it's in the Quran itself. And, sorry, go ahead.
So I meant more specifically, non-sexual acts that have been associated with these groups, like in the village, you see, it's really common to see, uncles, leaving from the masjid holding hands, and, it's
Sure.
or,
That's cultural, though. So
Yeah.
if it is not culturally associated with those groups, then it's fine. They're coming from a culture where it's not culturally associated with those groups. So it can shift from culture to culture. What's considered to be resembling can shift from culture to culture.
Yeah.
So if there's something, for example, like, I don't know, wearing a rainbow something, right?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
here,
Yeah.
someone might be like, okay, that's hook, line, and sinker. You're doing imitation or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be an inappropriate way for, during
But
Pride Week or something.
if I'm in a society or something like that where it doesn't register in people's minds, like the example that you're mentioning of holding hands, that would be fine. It would be fine.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Is it theologically problematic to believe that someone is born with homosexual urges or born a woman when they're genetically engaged?
Yeah, so,
Okay, so I do want to just shout out, Ustad Mubin has 40 pages, something like that, written.
Yeah, at least.
It's 2 articles called The Male is Not Like the Female. The Male is Not Like the Female, and it's all about, what is it about?
So male is not like the female. That one's on gender mainly and transgenderism. So, that one's quite deep. And then there's actually one called Can Islam Accommodate Same-Sex Acts? That one gets into the whole discussion of sort of sexual orientation, quote unquote, and that idea. And so the brother asked whether or not it's theologically problematic to believe that someone was born a certain way. In some ways, I'd say that whether or not someone was born that way is not really that relevant for us, right? What's more relevant is how a person chooses to act, right? In some ways, a person can be predisposed to doing certain things. There are a lot of theories about homosexuality in general, for instance. There's a big debate as to environmental factors, social factors, biological factors. Perhaps it's some combination of all of them, right? Perhaps it's some combination of all of them. And there may be other things that are like that predispose us to act in certain ways, do certain things, to incline towards different things. Those inclinations or desires, just because they exist, don't immediately legitimate the acts that come from them, right? We might say that someone is sort of naturally predisposed to, things
Drinking
that we
alcohol.
Yeah, drinking alcohol, or even your transgenderism question. We might say that it's possible for a man to be naturally interested in things that we typically associate with women. That doesn't then justify his dressing like a woman, right? We'd say no, that's prohibited because there's clear proofs against that, right? And so, the question is, how does a person relate to those desires? And how do they manage them or mitigate them and try to shift, right? Because a person can either mitigate and manage it in a way where they place greater emphasis on other things in their lives, such that they're not controlled by their sexual desires all the time, or perhaps they go into things where, a person may normatively have certain interests that they say are more feminine, but some of those things may not be exclusively feminine. They can be overlapped. And if they're overlapping interests, who cares? And if there are things that they can do that are beneficial within those realms, khalas, why would we have a problem with that, right? And so sometimes it just requires us to get into a little bit of detail. Where the theological problem comes in is when someone says, this is what I was born, and therefore that's what I want to do, and no one can tell me that there's anything wrong with that. Well, even God can't tell you that there's something wrong with that? You've just put yourself in a position, God can't tell me like that there's something wrong with this. Well, that is a level of arrogance and conceit where now you're putting yourself and your desires above Allah. Right? That's the antithesis of what it means to be a Muslim, which is that you submit to Allah, not that you actually put Allah's command beneath you and say, well, I don't think that makes any sense, I don't like it. Or that I think my desires are more important than that. What you've done is you've taken your desires and you've actually made them a type of God. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about that as well in the Quran. If you've seen the one who takes اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى, right? Have you seen the one who takes as a Lord his own desires? His own desires. We ask Allah to protect us from that.
Ameen.
And Allah knows best.
Sisters, what y'all got? Yes.
Sure. 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 Yeah. So that's, I mean, those are more, like those are, I'd say they're generally smaller problems in that example, because you're talking about something where, okay, if they just like, if they acted in ways that were, contextually or culturally aware, where maybe there are things that are culturally sort of more normal in Muslim spaces, but they're not as normal in non-Muslim spaces, so I'm not going to do those things in front of non-Muslims because I don't want to weird them out or something. That's not like a major sacrifice, right? That's not a major sacrifice, and so sometimes people just learn those things along the way, right? I think obviously the bigger issue is that, people have certain things that they grow accustomed to in Muslim spaces, and then, those beliefs, those values, those ideas are directly or indirectly being confronted in society. And that's the more common form of alienation, where it's like, okay, does my religion even make sense when it is so directly at odds with the society that I'm in? And that's the type of thing that we have to try to prepare our young people for, is to not only have a confident and positive articulation of what their beliefs are, but also to understand how different society is in so many spaces. Because society can change in a lot of ways. I mean, in my own lifetime, the way that most people, for instance, look at something like abortion, right? In the 90s, it was still very common for people to get abortions. But I'd say that even politically, if one looked in the 90s, the Democratic Party platform was not uncritically in favor of it. You had Blue Dog Democrats. President Clinton famously said something like abortion. He was in favor of legalizing it, but he said it should be legal, available, and it should be rare. He said it should be rare. Right? That's what he said. Now, no one would, I can't imagine hearing that today from even like a Republican. I think most Republicans would probably hesitate to say something that explicit, except for a few, right? Maybe Ted Cruz would say that, Allah knows. I think that like just what happens is society's changed, right? Society changed, their norms, their values change. And we see this historically. You've had societies that have existed where certain things were very normal in those societies. And nevertheless, what was important for Muslims in those times and places was to uphold their convictions and to not lose them in the face of a society that saw those things as normal, right? And that's always what we have to do. And if that means that we're a minority and we stand out or we're looked at differently because of our values and positions, so be it, right? Our obligation here is to try to call people to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to guide them to goodness because we want good for them, to try to uphold and transmit our faith and beliefs and values to our children, and to work in the cause of preparing that and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from our efforts, and that perhaps through His blessing, some good will come about, because we don't know how society is going to change. Right? If society is changing that much every couple of years, maybe inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will mean for society to change in a better direction. It's not like, we don't know that it's just like damned to go one way or another. And so we should try to be agents of positive change in the societies that we're in. And in order to be those agents of positive change, we actually have to be people who are engaged in the process of trying to change it positively. Like if we're not doing that, who else is going to do it? Like who are we expecting to speak up for positive values if we're not doing it on our own? We can't abdicate responsibility and hope just like magically society changes on its own that way. So Allah knows best. I hope that helps. So, any other questions?
Any other questions? Because the question that I have is, with all of that as far as standing up and challenging and engaging and all that type of stuff, the problem is, uniquely, I'm sure you've noticed, is that this is the topic that nobody wants to touch, ever.
Yeah.
The stakes are so high and the punishment is so severe, no matter what sphere you're in, whether it's corporate, whether it's academic, whether it's a student, whether it's...
Yeah, I mean, I think a person speaks about it in whatever capacity they can. It's probably not the type of thing you're going to go into the office and start giving da'wah around, unless you want to lose your job, right? That's usually a PR violation, and then you don't talk about religion in workplaces anyways. In other spaces, you may have an opportunity. So for instance, if you have a local school board here that's considering changing its curriculum to start teaching some of these things, as a Muslim parent and as members of your local district or county or whatever, you should go there as a concerned parent, as a concerned community member, and say, look, I oppose these. I oppose these changes on grounds of my own values, of my own convictions, and here's why they make sense, and I think that this is wrong to teach our children. And you know what? Those changes may still happen in spite of you saying that, but you should still do it. Whether you're going to be successful or not shouldn't guide your actions. You should still make a good faith effort and attempt. And that's what we need to do. And I think when people actually learn a little bit about the subject, figure out how to talk about it, I think that apprehension goes away. I think people are really scared in the beginning to talk about things, but once they begin and grow accustomed to talking about those things, that fear begins to subside and they gain confidence. So that's one of the things, right? Like you have to start in order to break that barrier. And the more you get accustomed to breaking that barrier, the less daunting it feels, right? And the less fearful you are when it comes to talking about certain subjects that right now you may feel unprepared to discuss. And there's a really good podcast. It's by a brother named Wahid Jensen. It's called Away Beyond the Rainbow. Away Beyond the Rainbow. You can Google it. The brother is, he has same-sex attractions, but he's a very committed Muslim. He has, I think he's almost 80 episodes in. Each one is at least an hour. He has a transcript that he has typed up for every single episode. So if you want to listen to it or you want to read it, you can read it. He's addressed this from every conceivable angle. Psychologically, socially, politically, this and that. I've been on it like 5 times now. And so other people have as well. Sheikh Mustafa Umar from California has been on it, I think 3 or 4 times at least. But he's had a number of people on it. I think, in fact, Imam Dawood Walid's been on it or is going on it soon. And so, mashallah, he's had some really good guests. But in addition to that, he's had Joseph Nicolosi Jr., who's been on it, who is an advocate of reparative therapy, so it's psychotherapy. He's had different academics. He's had a lot of people that have been guests on the podcast, and I think there's a lot of value. So even if you're going to ask yourself, like the human question, someone's, has these desires, they're straddled with it, are they just supposed to live lonely the rest of their lives? Well, I think like he offers a really good first-hand perspective from somebody who has those desires and actually confronts those types of questions head on. And I think does an excellent job. And so I would encourage that as a resource for people who are interested in it. Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Yeah.
Any last question? Last question? Okay, go ahead, Hannah. What's your question?
Sure, yeah.
Just repeat the question.
So the sister asked about like pronouns. and pronoun preferencing. Obviously, it like goes back to homosexuality as well. Like, are you in a context where you can talk about it or disagree, right? Or just not pronoun identify? If you are, then you don't do it, right? I mean, there's like 70 or something genders now on social media and all that, right? I mean, if you don't have to do it, you don't. And if you have the opportunity to actually, not necessarily speak against it or explain why it's wrong or why, something like that is a problem, you should avail yourself of that, right? If someone, if I had an opportunity to talk to somebody who tells me like, their pronoun is Z, I might not start off the discussion that way, but at some point maybe I'd get to know the person, and along the way I'd say, hey, I noticed your pronoun Z. That's not really a normal thing. Tell me a little bit about that. And we may be able to have a conversation, and as part of a discussion, I could try to explain to that person why I actually think that's, I think that's a problem. Why I think that actually creates issues, right? Now, again, that may not be the first discussion I have with that person, especially if it's somebody who I'm going to be, maintaining some sort of long-term relationship with or getting to know. But even then, if you're in spaces where you don't have to submit to that type of protocol, don't, right? No, if no one's forcing you to do it, don't do it. If someone is forcing you to do it, then do it to whatever limited level you have to. And hopefully those things don't become coercive, which is part of the problem, obviously, for us today. Allah knows best.
Jazakallah khair. So with that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll end tonight. We'll continue tomorrow, inshallah, with the full course. We'll be starting at Dhuhr, inshallah, and then continuing until 5 p.m.
Inshallah.
We'll have a PowerPoint, inshallah ta'ala. We'll have a setup. And
Okay,
so bring your notes. It's going to be hopefully incredibly fruitful. We want to be able to absorb these concepts, be able to articulate them so that we can, in your discussions with everybody else, because it's not just about...
Yeah, so inshallah my plan is the first hour to really spend the time on theology, which is the questions of belief. And then from there, start building up our discussion of sexuality, gender. The idea is that once we understand the foundational elements of a society like ours and what an Islamic society or an Islamic worldview looks like, it becomes easier to start applying concepts to things. Right? Those concepts, it's just a question of now I understand the core concepts. Let me begin applying them to these situations and scenarios. So I'm hoping, inshallah, to do that. We'll see how successful I am at it.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair, everybody. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.